Okay, so let's start with the PowerPoint. Slide one's always a good place to start. So today we're going to talk about quantitative analysis. Now, the first thing I want to say about this is don't get freaked out by that phrase, okay? Because it sounds a bit kind of, academic and, pompous even, quantitative analysis. But what it basically means, really simple, is counting things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., which you've been doing since the age of, I don't know, 3, 4, 5. So I say that not to patronise anybody, but the reason I say it is sometimes I've noticed over the years that when I introduce students to this method, they kind of get a bit freaked out by it because it's like percentages and aggregates. And in my experience, media students and journalism students are almost allergic to numbers. And, sometimes people choose journalism by extension of English language, English literature, journalism, because they hate numbers so much. But can I just put your mind at rest? Two things. Firstly, it's not rocket science. It's not like you're going to be working at NASA doing sort of weird and wonderful calculations. It's not that level. It's very, very straightforward. And secondly, as you'll see, it's very revealing. So it's quite a straightforward, easy method to do, and you'll get some good results. So please don't be freaked out as soon as you start seeing numbers. I say that purely for the reason that that in previous years, it's a real trend amongst media students is that they choose media because it doesn't have numbers in it. But believe it or not, numbers in media studies can do wonderful things to your dissertation and to your other work. So before we start the the lecture proper, a couple of announcements. So just to confirm, as you know, me and Chris switched around our lectures. So this lecture should have been last week, and Chris should have been with you today. But thankfully, we sorted it all out. So last week you did discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis with Chris. And I know Chris pretty well, and I know that he does a good show, and he really knows his stuff. So hopefully, and I'm sure he inspired and informed you last week about discourse analysis. Second point I want to make is that yes, the assessments are approaching. Still a couple of weeks away for the poster. Yeah, it's 2 weeks today, isn't it? The poster presentations. But two things really, really important, and I apologise for this, but it's the bureaucracy that has won the day here. Everybody needs to submit the poster on Turnitin. So please submit your poster on Turnitin, either as a PowerPoint, a single PowerPoint slide, or a JPEG, an image file. Now the reason that you have to do this, because I know that you also have to do the Zoom presentation as well, so everybody's got 10-15 minutes to talk about their poster. I'll sort out a schedule next week so that you know when you're going to be. We'll just do it randomly. So everybody gets 10-15 minutes. So you will present your poster to me and Chris. We'll watch it online and we'll ask you a few questions, and that will be it. It's like a nice pleasant trip to the dentist, not one of those horrible ones where you lose a tooth. It's like one of the trips to the dentist where the dentist says, oh yeah, excellent, thank you very much, come again, see you in 6 months. It's that sort of thing, so don't get freaked out by it, okay? But you also have to upload your poster to Moodle, and you'll notice that I've set up the link there, the Turnitin link. So just literally one slide of PowerPoint, one image, upload it before 2 o'clock on the 11th of December, and you would have successfully completed that mission. And the other one is the blog, and I know this sounds a bit crazy because you're doing it already online, aren't you? You're doing it on the ePortfolio, but we also need the blog as a single document, and that is so that the external examiner, the person who checks our marking basically from another university, he or she can access it easily. So we need to have documentary evidence of your blog. So when you've done your blog, simply copy and paste your text, put it in a Word document, save it as you normally do, and then upload it to Turnitin before the 2 o'clock on Friday the 18th. And it's the same obviously with your third piece of work, the 2,000 word piece of work. So I've set up the 3 Turnitin links. You know what you need to do, you know how to use Turnitin now. As always, don't leave it until the last minute. It happens every year because I can see what time the work comes in, and somebody will leave it until 13:58 on the day of submission before she uploads the document. And then guess what happens? The internet crashes or something else goes wrong, and then I get an email about 3 o'clock in the afternoon saying, Gary, I couldn't send it up in time. And then, you know, I have to patiently say, okay, please send it to me and we'll do it. It's just a pain in the proverbial. So don't leave it until the last minute. Okay, so that's what you need to do with Turnitin. Next slide, tutorials. Now, I've had a few tutorials over recent weeks, and quite a few emails as well, from students asking for my thoughts and comments on their ideas. Hopefully, because I think me and Chris do our jobs relatively well, after the tutorials the students have been more enlightened and more focused and a clearer idea of what they need to do. So the key point here, folks, is if you need a tutorial, and some of you might not need it, you might be in complete control of what you're doing and perfectly happy and comfortable. If that's the case, wonderful. If you have any doubts, don't delay. Don't leave it until, where would the cutoff be? If you have a tutorial with me for the first time in the week commencing, what is it, the 7th of December, I think it is, that's probably too late, because that will give you 4 days to do all the reading and do all the thinking and structure your poster and submit it. So really, next week is when you should have the tutorial, if you need one. If you need one. So it's completely up to you. I'm not going to insist. I'm not going to force it on you. You have to decide whether you need a tutorial. And please don't come to me and say, Gary, I've got no ideas, because I'm not going to come up with ideas for you. I think we've given you enough hints and tips and guidance on how to generate ideas over the past 7-8 weeks. Can I also just say as well, and it's kind of there by implication, but if your focus is TV, so if you're going to do some research involving TV, or for that matter online, you know, streaming services, Netflix, whatever, YouTube, and stroke or its discourse analysis, contact Chris, because those are Chris's specialisms. He is TV and discourse analysis. That's what he's, more than anything else, what he's really good at. He's good at lots of other things as well, but those are his two specialities. And if you're not sure, or if it's newspapers, if it's websites, if it's the stuff we're going to do today, if it involves interviews or surveys, which we'll do next week, then contact me. So let's just try and divide the workload a little bit. So if it's definitely TV, and I know some of you doing TV, go directly to Chris and speak to him, because he's the font of all knowledge on this one. And if you're not sure, contact me. Something else that you need to do ideally before you speak to us about the tutorial, in a tutorial, is that you need to read some related academic studies. And there are loads of these already on Moodle. As you will see, there are, or as you can see, there are 3 last week. Chris put some academic studies up for discourse analysis. I added 3 in week 6, and there's another 3 today, and you need to go and find some more. So the whole point of this, as I said in week 1, do you remember my phrase, or Isaac Newton's phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants? So you need to put in your poster and in assessment 3, you have to show us that you have an appreciation of the work, the research that's been done already in your area. So you're going to build on that. So those academic studies must be mentioned in the right context. Otherwise, obviously, your mark is going to come down, because it's your work won't be academic in that way. And obviously, read the guidance and criteria documents. A lot of questions I'm getting through email suggest that students have not read them. So everything you need, folks, is up there on Moodle. The guidance and criteria, you've got some examples of good posters, which I'll come on to in a moment. You've got loads of reading material, you've got the PowerPoints, you've got the videos. So we're now throwing the ball back to you, and we're saying, okay, go ahead, give it your best shot and show us what you can do. You know, so the time has come really to take the initiative. And the other thing to do is to use last year's distinction level submissions of posters for guidance and inspiration. And if you get really stuck, folks, you know, don't overcomplicate things. Next slide, number 5. don't overcomplicate things. So this is a distinction-winning poster from last year. I did this in week 2, I think, and talked you through it. But spend some time reading this in detail, because this student, she got a distinction. So she did the right thing. Obviously the topic's going to be different to what you're doing, but look at how she phrases her words, look at how she positions her study. She follows the brief beautifully. And as I said in the previous slide, if you get stuck, just fill in the boxes, literally fill in the boxes. You know, so you need what is that, 100 words or so, 150 words, introduction. You need a bit more on central issues. You need a research question. You need a methodology, and you need a summary. And this student has broken up her words pretty well here. She hasn't done too much introduction and not enough methodology. She's done it just right. So use her submission as inspiration for your work. So you've got to structure it. And structure is so important. What we don't want is just a sort of chaotic load of facts just dumped down, because that isn't going to really satisfy the criteria. So there was a good one from last year. Be inspired by that one. And the other one, which was a distinction which I showed you, was this one. Like I said in week 2, the only issue I have with this really is the colour. So just be really careful. Make it legible. That paragraph in the middle left under central issues, to me, is not very legible. And it might seem a small thing, but the whole point is that the reader of your poster understands it relatively quickly. And with that purple on white on purple, I still struggle now to read it. So just look at how you lay it out. You will get marks for good layout, good presentation. But again, this was a distinction, and this student did it very well. She followed the brief well, she answered the questions, and the markers could understand what she was doing and where her research was going to go. So be inspired by those. Just to reiterate, please don't just send me an email saying, I want to do celebrities in the media. That my heart would sink through the floor if I got an email like that. And the reason being, celebrities in the media is enormous. And my immediate response would be to you, which celebrities, which media, over which period. So narrow it down, and don't just say I want to look at celebrities in the media. Tell us what you want to look at exactly. What are you looking at? Their representation? Are you looking at their political messages that are being conveyed when celebrities, Kardashians, classic example, the political message of the Kardashians in the program, what's it called, Keeping Up with the Kardashians. You could do something like that. It wouldn't personally be my first choice, but if that's your passion in life, you can do that. But key point, be precise. Don't just say in society, in the media. You know, celebrities, far too huge. Look at how these students have narrowed it down and produce some really good, tightly focused work. Okay, let me just say a few more things before we start talking about quantitative analysis. And I've also noticed from some student submissions so far, or student ideas, there's a bit of confusion about what methodology is. Methodology, the way to think about it, if you are confused, is it's like a recipe. So if you're making, I don't know, a lasagna, you will follow a recipe, and if you give me that recipe and I follow it too, then we should produce the same lasagna, right? So that's the whole point of methodology, is that the researcher will lay out what he or she has done and why he or she has done it. They will also talk about the limitations, because no methodology is perfect, and then if somebody else were to follow the same methodology, you should come up with the same result. So have a look at this one. The paper is on Moodle on week 6, the picture of Jeremy Corbyn on the front, done by Justin Schlossberg, 2016, and Justin lays out here on page 6 exactly what he does. So he says, so he's doing an analysis of the reporting of Jeremy Corbyn. So he tells us which news organisations, there's the list, starts with BBC, Daily Mail, etc. Which news organisations, over what period. He says about, he also comments, if you read it further, about the search term. So he's searching for articles about Jeremy Corbyn. And then he also talks about his sampling strategy as well, because he gets so many articles, he can't analyse them all, so he reduces them. But if you get confused about methodology, read that paper, or at least page 6 of that paper. It describes it very well. And also, as I said, that this paper, there it is again on the right, it's a very good example of quantitative analysis. So I would actually suggest you sit down and just specifically read that paper, and you will understand pretty quickly and pretty clearly what quantitative analysis is and what it can do. And also, as I said 2 weeks ago, I've put my a PDF of my book, there it is on the left, up onto Moodle. So you can, I wouldn't suggest reading the whole thing. But I would suggest you read chapter 2, which is the research design. It explains how I designed the research. And then you've got in detail the 3 case studies in chapters 3, 4 and 5. The one we spoke about, or I spoke about in week 6, is chapter 5. The globalization one with the protesters is chapter 3. So you really do need to engage. It's not, you know, doing a good job with assessments 1 and 3 isn't just a case of, you know, just sort of writing stuff. You do have to refer to other works and understand how other scholars have done their research as well. So there's 2 examples there of quantitative analysis, and there's more examples of good quality research this week on Moodle on week 8. So I've made these available and you can download these at your leisure. Well, not too leisurely, because we don't have a huge amount of time left. You've only got 2 weeks. So in the middle you'll see this is actually a BA dissertation, a journalism dissertation from a couple of years ago by a student called Isabel Kern, and she did quantitative analysis, and she looked at 2 American newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times. So it's a comparative study, and she was looking at how the political interference rumours of Donald Trump, remember him, and the Russian state were covered by 2 newspapers. And on the right there's another paper about the reporting of Jeremy Corbyn, which ties in neatly with Justin Schlossberg's one in the previous slide. So loads of examples. There's at least 6 examples of good content analysis, quantitative analysis. Let me just talk about assessment 2. So assessment 2, the guidance and criteria is on Moodle. Again, I went through this in week 2, but this is just a reminder. When in doubt, folks, follow the brief. It's all on Moodle, in great lengthy vivid detail. My guidance for assessment 3, I don't think I could possibly give you more guidance for assessment 3. I give you examples of writing and how to structure it and the criteria and everything. So that's slide number 11. Let me just talk briefly. Oh my goodness, time is running out as always. Let me talk briefly, just a couple of things. Now I know some of you, slide 12, some of you have already studied academic subjects at BA level, but some of you haven't. And this is where my job actually gets quite difficult, because I'm in danger of patronising half the class and insulting the other half of the class, but I'm going to carry on anyway, because it's really important that you know how to read an academic book. Now I put it in speech marks because it's not really reading. It's a bit of a, I wouldn't say a cheat, it's a clever way of working. So if you get an academic book, something like this wonderful specimen, written by a guy called Merrill, you don't need to read the whole thing to get a sense of what it's about. So when you're doing your research for your poster and for assessment 3, you start by reading the blurb, number 1. So the blurb is that on the back of the book. So that tells you in brief what the book is about. This book assesses the extent to which British news organisations gave exposure and credence to different political interpretations of economics and business. So in 1 sentence that tells you what the book's about. Now it might be that that's all you need to know about the book, and then you can put it in your work. You know, as Merrill, brackets 2019, discovered with his work, and you can say what it is. The next thing to do is, if that's really interesting and relevant, you move on to the next stage, which is reading the table of contents, which you will find typically very near the start of the book. So that will tell you in very simple descriptive terms what the different chapters will cover. Then you read the introduction to the chapter. Academic books are all laid out in the same way. There's the introduction. So you're not actually starting on page 1 and finishing on page 250. You can do it step by step. And the more that you read it, if it becomes really, really relevant, then you can read more of it. So you don't have to read the whole thing. You need to get a sense of what the book's about and what the major discoveries are and what the methodology are. So I said at the bottom, a rough estimate, reading a chapter of a book is properly is about 1 to 2 hours work, but you've obviously got to find the right chapters. Not every chapter in the book will be relevant, and so typically you'll find the essence of the book on the blurb, in the first chapter, in the last chapter, and in the introductions to the individual chapters. So the key point here, folks, is don't feel that you've got to read every word of every book. If you use your brain and do it, sort of sensibly, you can basically get the essence of a book in a very, very short period of time. So that's just for anybody who's never been taught how to do that. I don't know how many of you have. Referencing, we use Harvard referencing. You will lose marks if your referencing is bad. And there are slight variations on Harvard referencing, but when I say it and when other teachers here say it, this is what we mean. So look at the referencing here. This is an outtake from my PhD, chapter 2, I think. So look at that. It says, poorly understood concept, Elwood, 2002:8. So that means the book written by Elwood in 2002, page 8. That's how we do it. We don't need the whole list of the book. We don't need the name of the book. We don't need a hyperlink there. We just need author's name, year, page number. Very, very straightforward. I don't know why people get referencing so confused. It is slightly different depending on what you're quoting. So next slide, 14. If you're referring to the general argument or the findings of the book or article, your reference should just feature the author and the year. So the book in general, as Merrill found in 2019, right-wing interpretations of the economy are giving more exposure than left-wing interpretation. That kind of sums my book up. But if you're referring, next point, to a specific fact or a quote or an argument or some data, your reference should feature the author, the year and the page number. So it says in the quote underneath, Ofcom 2007:25, page 25, and Peston 2009, page 18. How to present a bibliography. Please don't mess this up. It frustrates me every year because it's so easy to do, and yet students still mess it up. And it's really, really simple. That's how you do a book, a reference in your bibliography. Elwood W 2002, page. This is slide 15. A journal article, slightly different. Notice that the title of the journal is in italics, and notice how I use speech marks for the title of the article. A journalism article in the Guardian, in the BBC or whatever, same principle. Author's name, title, title of the publication of the Guardian in italics, and then the date, and then web pages. Notice on web pages you have to say when they were accessed, because web pages can be deleted, especially if they're contentious. So make sure that you say when they are accessed. So that's how to do bibliographies, and don't forget slide 16, they should be alphabetical on the author's name. So author's last name, family name as well, and if there is no author, put the name of the publication. So the BBC, for example, a lot of articles on the BBC, on the news website, they don't have authors' names. Another a magazine that doesn't have authors' names, The Economist. So in that case, you put the name of the organisation, BBC or The Economist, if there's no author's name. And yeah, so that is essentially a crash course in not messing up your referencing and bibliography. Because the reason I say this, folks, is because it happens every year. And I just think it's really sad when somebody puts a lot of effort into a piece of work and then they get the referencing and the bibliography wrong. It is important, it's very important, especially in academic work, because it's all about credibility. If you get those things wrong, then people start questioning your credibility as an academic. So, like I said, I'm apologising if I've patronised anybody, because you know this already, but some people in this class have not had that coaching before, and my job is to make sure everybody achieves a reasonable level of achievement, basically. Right, let's move on. Quantitative analysis. Slide number 17. Okay, so the clue's in the name, quantitative analysis. So this is an analytical technique which is widely used in media journalism research and other sorts of research. And it's used to quantify. So that's the mystery solved. What it means is it's quantifying. So in other words, it's things that you can count. Things that you can go 1, 2, 3 with. They are what's called measurable variables. So a variable is a characteristic of a certain thing. So it's called a variable because it can vary between items. So a measurable variable in people, for example, is height or weight. Or you could say things like IQ or those types of things. They are measurable as well. And the thing to do, if you get confused about it, is compare it to qualitative. So the two main types of analysis, certainly in journalism research, are quantitative and qualitative. So qualitative, which is what Chris was talking about last week, discourse analysis, that's the qualities of a piece of journalism or a film or whatever it might be. So it's not the same. Qualities can't be quantified, not in the same way. So you're talking about the language, you're talking about photographs, and so on. So quantitative analysis is all about measurable variables. So it's looking at aggregates, in other words, adding things up, and averages, and you all know what averages are. Now, the best thing about quantitative analysis is that it's objective. It's objective. So in other words, it is factual, for want of a better word. It's not subjective, like qualitative analysis can sometimes be accused of being. That wasn't very, very clear how I said it. Let me start again. Qualitative analysis, like discourse analysis, is sometimes criticised for being subjective. So if Chris is doing some discourse analysis, he might find something different to what I found. So it depends on how I or he looks at it, what our own personal preferences and maybe even prejudices are. So that's one of the criticisms of qualitative. Quantitative, on the other hand, it's a bit like if you watch a football match and Tottenham beat Arsenal 3-0. Okay, it's not a matter of opinion. Everybody can see that 3 goals went into the net. There might be a dispute about whether it was a penalty or not, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's 3-0. Okay, so that's quantitative. It's something which is objective. And if I do the analysis and somebody else does the analysis, we'll come up with the same results. Final point on this slide, it's also scalable, so you can do huge content analyses. I've seen content analysis that involve 2, 3, 4, 5,000 articles. Not so many. My PhD was 1,625, but it still took a long time. So you can do a small quantitative analysis or big ones. It's procedural, step by step, very easy to describe to somebody else how you've done and why you've done it. It's repeatable, so somebody else could do it exactly the same way and come up with the same answer. And it's also open to scrutiny. So somebody can just check basically your recipe, how you've done it, and verify that you've done it in a noble and sort of rigorous way. So those are the really good points about quantitative analysis, and it's very straightforward. So it's all about counting measurable variables. Next slide, and I apologise here for this next slide because it is quite dense academic speak. But one thing, but it is important because in assessment 3, folks, you might want to write this down, but you really need to talk about the limitations of your method, the limitations of your approach, because no approach in media research is 100% watertight. Every approach has its downside as well as its positives. So what I've done here, just so you don't need to read the whole thing, towards the top it says, although quantitative content analysis follows in the positivist, and that's kind of a pompous word meaning scientific, you know, like Isaac Newton and Einstein, people like that, it is not totally objective. Researchers inevitably exercise a degree of subjective delineation. So in other words, a researcher will say, well, that's important, but that's not important, so we won't measure it, in choosing variables. And the second paragraph, quantitative analysis fragments text, so the original context is lost. So in other words, you could be looking for a certain word or a certain phrase, but by finding it, you don't notice how that phrase was encapsulated, the context of the phrase. And the other important thing is there's no inbuilt theory of meaning. So just because an article or a series of articles say a certain thing, for example about Jeremy Corbyn, don't assume that people believe it. Okay, that's really, really important. Just because something's written, it doesn't mean people automatically believe it. So there's no inbuilt theory of meaning. And there's another comment at the bottom: a researcher cannot make valid inferences about significance. So in other words, if a newspaper says 1,000 times that Jeremy Corbyn is a communist, it doesn't necessarily mean, just because it's 1,000 times, that everybody believes it. It might actually work the other way and people start disputing. You keep saying it, something that's patently untrue, it might actually rub people up the wrong way. So don't go down that track of using quantitative analysis to assume that it controls audiences in such a widespread way. But anyway, the reason I use slide 18 is to show you how you address limitations of your method. So for assessment 3, really important that you put something in there about limitations. Okay, now hopefully, has everybody got a magazine? I'm assuming that you do. So let's go diving into the deep end of the swimming pool, and let's do a bit of quantitative analysis. The only issue I have with the problem with this method is I find it difficult to say for some reason. Okay, so what I've got is the New Statesman magazine. It doesn't matter what date it is, but this one just happens to be September. And what we did last year, so if we were in a class as human beings, as God intended, in real life, we would actually be doing this exercise now. So what I did last year is I brought in 15 copies of the New Statesman, same magazine, different issues over a period of time. And I gave them out to the class. So everybody had their own personal copy of the New Statesman. And then I said, okay, folks, have a look at your magazine and you tell me, we're doing quantitative analysis now, we're doing quantitative content analysis, so it's the journalism. And I said, what can you measure objectively? And the hint I gave was, think how many. How many? So what can you count in this magazine? So folks, it's not perfect because we're all remote, but I'm going to throw it back to you. You tell me, answer that question. What can you measure objectively in your magazine, or any magazine for that matter? Over to you. Anybody, turn your microphone off, don't forget. Don't try and overcomplicate it. What can you measure? What's the most obvious thing? Who's that?
The most obvious things is the title, which is the catchy title, and subtitle to it, to the magazine.
But how can you measure it, Sandra?
The quantitative.
So no, because you're saying no. I think you're going down the qualitative route. So you can look at what the title says.
Okay.
Let me just say,
okay.
I've got a comment from Saida. So she's typed a comment. Saida, you're on the right track. So Saida has said the number of pictures and the number of articles. Right. So think about it that way, Sandra. Think about the number of. Think how many,
right.
how many, how many, how many. So Saida's absolutely spot on. She said the number of pictures and the number of articles. Saida, which magazine? Have you got a magazine with you, Saida?
Yes, but it's really old and it's weekly. It's Daily Mail weekly.
Oh, don't worry. It doesn't matter. Anything is good. So Saida's got the Daily Mail weekly. So she's saying number of pictures, number of articles. Okay, so you've got us off to a good start, Saida. Anybody else? What else can we measure?
Maybe articles on a certain subject.
Correct. Very good. Saida, you had some good breakfast this morning, obviously.
I didn't.
You sound like you're on good form. So Saida said the number of articles on a certain subject. Excellent. What else? Anybody? The amount of adverts. Sophia, correct. Manisha, half a second later, Manisha said exactly the same thing. Exactly, you can count the number of advertisements, but better than that, you can count how many pages of advertisements. Right, so you're on the right track. So you're looking at how many. Excellent, good stuff. Let's move on to the next slide. And this applies to any magazine, any newspaper, any website for that matter. So objective measurements, next slide, slide 20. As you've said, the number of pages, the number of articles, the number of words per article, or the number of words in total, the number of photos, or you can do the number of photos of people, the number of photos of abstract photos, the number of photos of animals, or whatever it might be. Next point that Sophia and Manisha said almost simultaneously, the number of pages of advertising versus the number of pages of journalism. That's a really, really good one. Has anybody got Cosmopolitan or Vogue or any of those sort of fashion lifestyle magazines? And I remember seeing, I couldn't find it. I tried to find it yesterday on YouTube. I saw a video of some youngsters doing content analysis of Cosmopolitan, which is about that thick, right? It's about 300 pages. And they literally ripped out all the advert pages and put them on one side, and then they put the journalism on the other side. The advert section was about that thick, and the journalism section was about that thick. So when you buy Cosmopolitan, this is a very, very powerful statement, but when you buy Cosmopolitan, you're buying advertising. You're actually paying for adverts rather than journalism, which I always find bizarre. And like Saida hints, going back to the slide, you can talk about the number of articles in terms of the topic. How many articles are about politics? How many articles are about economics? How many articles are about sport or books, etc.? And that can tell you quite a lot, because it can tell you what the magazine or newspaper is focused on, what it's all about. So what we're going to look at now, or what we did look at last year, imagine you've got a copy of the New Statesman. What we looked at last year was not actually the content so much as the journalists. So you can also do an assessment of the people involved in the process. Remember sociology of journalism? So it's journalism is a people thing. So you can count the journalists, and you can look at them from a number of different angles. So this is the exercise I gave last year. Flick through your copy of the New Statesman, ignore the adverts, focus on articles only, and look at the names of journalists, and they're usually in the New Statesman printed in red, and record the number of males in the first section, females in the first section, males in the second section, females in the second section. Now, the reason I talk about first and second section is that this magazine, the New Statesman, political magazine, the first section, which goes up to about page 38, is all the serious stuff, politics, conflict, COVID, all that sort of stuff. The second section, which starts around page 40, is called the critics, and this is sort of book reviews, movie reviews, food, all that type of thing. So you've got the first section, which is all the serious stuff, and the second section, which is sort of lifestyle and all the fun stuff. So I said to the class, take your copy of the magazine and literally just flick through it. So when you see a name in red, you make a note using the tally system, as I've done here, whether that person is male or female. So that was what we did last year. The magazine, next slide, 22. The magazine that I had was November the 20th. And in the first section, as you'll see from the top left of that table, I found 10 men. And in the first section, I found 4 female names. In the second section, 10 men. And in the second section, there were 8 female names. So that was step 2. Let me just go back one, actually. So go back to slide 21. You'll notice I've said step 1, methodology. So at this point, you can explain to somebody what you're doing. We're going to count how many male names in the first section and how many females in the first section and second section as well. So that's step 1, is do your methodology. And this one is very simple. Just count the number of journalists and make a note of their gender. Second step is the data collection. So that's what I did. Very, very straightforward. And then the next, so the immediate question from on slide 23, we've got the data, but it's no good as it stands, is it? We need to do something with it. So question back to you folks, there's the data, 10 men in the first section, 4 women in the first section, 10 men in the second section, 8 women in the second section. What can we do with this data? Because it's no good as it stands. We need to do something with it. We need to talk about it. We need to explain it. Over to you. Because imagine writing this up. If you just say, you know, there are 10 men in the first section and 4 women in the first section, that doesn't tell us anything. That's just description. That's actually quite boring. No, okay. Let's move on. Let's move on. Maybe it's baffled. Well, the first thing to do. This is step 3. Is that you analyse the data. So don't just have the data in raw form. That doesn't really do much. So put it into a table, and I'm sure you can all do this. This is at this point that media students kind of start switching off a bit because we're doing percentages, but just bear with me because it's very revealing. So if you put it into a table like I've done there, first section, second section, total, male and female, and total that way, you can convert it into a percentage. Okay, so the first percentage there's 10 men out of a total of 14 in the first section. So if you convert that to a percentage, next slide, lo and behold, that's 71%. 71%. So by extension, the remaining journalists in the first section, 29% are female. Second section, there are a total of 18 journalists, 10 men, 8 women. So the proportion there is 55 to 45. And then the total overall is 63% of the journalists in the magazine on November the 20th were men and 37% were women. So, and then the next stage is to write 3 bullet points or 80 words about this data. Let's not do the writing, but tell me verbally, what do you make of this data? So the next stage is to comment on your data analysis. But you see, just by converting it into a simple percentage, all of a sudden the doors of knowledge swing open because you've actually discovered something. You've actually discovered something here. So tell me verbally your interpretation. Yes, Saida, go on, keep going, Saida. Tell me verbally, Saida, turn your microphone on.
Well, it shows that the majority of journalists are males, therefore they're reporting from the male perspective.
Oh, slow down slightly. Now, and just choose your words very carefully, Saida. The only thing you can say with certainty is that the majority of journalists in this edition of this magazine are male.
Oh yeah, specifically, yes.
Right. So
Okay.
hang on. Be very, very precise, and be careful about making that second statement, because you cannot, with integrity, make the second statement that you made. So
Okay.
just keep it simple. So start again. Try again. So the majority of
the journalists in this particular issue are male.
Yes. And
Predominantly.
correct. Now what you've just said, Saida, is perfect. That's perfect. That's very good, simple description of what the numbers say. Right now, Saida, you're on a roll as always. Give me another piece of information. So look at the difference between first section, second section.
It's almost double in numbers. So it's 1/3 of the number.
What's nearly double?
The number of male journalists are at least half higher than the female.
Yeah, kind of. Anybody else? Let me bring somebody else in. You're not quite there. Come on, folks. It's not hopefully not rocket science. This just say what you see. All right. Let me throw it back to you because we're running out of time. Right. So in the first section, basically 71% male, 29% female. So it's almost, what's that? It's twice, 2.5 times as many men as women in the first section. In the second section, it's more equal, isn't it? It's 10 to 8, 10 and 8. In the first section, it's 10 and 4. So there are more women in the second section. So the second section has more females compared to males, but it's still more males. So if you go on to the next slide, so this is step 3, data analysis, the words. So the first stage is to do your methodology. The second stage is to collect the data. The third stage is to analyse the data. So what Saida started doing, although she kind of stopped halfway through because she went down the wrong track, she was absolutely right, saying that there are more men than women. So here's my words on the right hand side. Male journalists are clearly in the majority in the first section of the November 20th magazine. Indeed, only 4 out of the 14 journalists in this section, 29%, are women. The balance is more even in the second section, with 10 male and 8 female journalists. Overall, this issue of the magazine features 32 named journalists, almost 2/3 of whom are male. Okay, so from some very simple data, you've already generated, what's that, 50, 60, 70 words of good quality academic analysis. Okay, and to me, this is why quantitative analysis is so good, because you find stuff out, you find truths. I mean, this is unequivocal. It doesn't matter who you are. If you analyse this magazine, you'll come up with the same data as I did, and it will show the same thing. So that's why quantitative analysis, to me, is really quite exciting, because it generates facts, it generates research findings very, very quickly. It's none of this sort of abstract discussions about postmodernism and neoliberalism. I'm not really a big fan of all that. This is the stuff I really like, because it's unequivocal. You know, it's there in black and white, in almost in technicolor sometimes. So the next thing that you can do with this data, if you want to make it even more appealing visually, you can convert that data into a chart. Slide number 27. So looking at the data at the bottom, there's 32 journalists in total, 20 of them are men, 12 of them are women, and that shows that it's about 2/3 male, 1/3 female, and much more visual. So you can use graphs and charts and pie charts and bar charts for your data with quantitative analysis. So moving on to slide number 28. How do we make sense of this data? Now, Saida, let me come back to you, because you made a second comment and I said be careful. Let's go back to that comment. So make the comment again, Saida. I've forgotten the precise words. What did you say second time?
Male journalists are reporting from the male perspective.
Okay, yeah, right. Okay, so can anybody tell me why that's kind of not really an advisable thing to say at this point? Can anybody tell me? Or Saida, maybe a self-criticism. Why is...
It can be presumption. It's not kind of specific unless you read everything. I mean, they can interview women and they can report it from female perspective.
You're absolutely right, Saida. Well done. That's good. You, like Saida says, to make a statement like that, you have to read every article. You can't just look at somebody's name. But we can still make sense of the data without going down that track. All right, let me ask you this, folks. Generally speaking, what percentage of the UK population is male and what percentage is female? So this is our normative expectation. So generally speaking, half the population of any country is female. It's actually slightly more because women live longer than men typically. So I think in the UK it's 51% female, 49% male. So that's our normative expectation, isn't it? That's what we would expect. But look at the data, 63-37. It should be 49-51. So how do we make sense of that? How do we let's come up with a hypothesis. Why might that be? Does it mean that the New Statesman is horribly sexist and it's discriminating against women? You could say that, but I don't know how you'd prove it. So what might another explanation be?
Sorry, the obvious would be that there is not many female in journalism, or maybe they are not as famous or not as majority still male.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, Saida, if you look at the data for the all journalists in the UK, so there's about 50,000 journalists in the UK. If you look at all of the data, then basically women are in it is kind of, how can I put it? It is kind of quite similar, male to female. If you look at journalism students, In my journalism MA class, every year it's 90% female. 90% female. So you could actually do something with this data and compare it to what we would expect, and compare it to the number of journalism students and so on. So you could do it that way. But the key point is that we would kind of normally expect, if this was just a magazine that about sort of life in general, you would expect half of the journalists to be male and half of them female, because it would reflect society, it would reflect the general population. Let's move on to slide 29. Because the other thing to do is to be careful not to make big assumptions based on one example. So far we've only looked at one magazine. It's one issue, which is November the 22nd last year. So to get more credibility, what we need to do is look at other issues of the same magazine. So if you were to do, you could do something like this for your poster, you could do something like this for assessment 3, but you would need to repeat the experiment over a number of issues. So if you're looking at, I don't know, how many people of South Asian ancestry feature on the pages of Cosmopolitan, you can't just choose one issue of Cosmopolitan. You'd need to do 10 issues of Cosmopolitan, because that shows a trend. It shows a tendency. So that's what I would suggest next. You add more data. So November the 22nd, you could also do other issues, the 15th, the 8th, the 1st, and so on. So about 8 or 10. And if you find the same pattern week after week, issue after issue, then you know that you're onto something. Otherwise, November the 22nd might just be a random and a rogue sample, essentially. So going on the right hand side, you would analyse and interpret again. So you can't make judgments based on just one issue. So the question, consistently more men than women? Is it the same every week? You'd look at the overall aggregate proportions for 15 magazines or 10 magazines. You'd look at what the average proportions for all 10 magazines are. So aggregate is adding them all up. The average proportions, what is the percentage for each of the magazines? You'd have a look at what was the most equitable issue. So which issue was it 50-50 or closest? Which was the least equitable issue? So there could be one where it's 80% men, 20% women. And the point which is difficult for you folks to appreciate, because you don't have the magazines in front of you, but essentially the New Statesman, the first section is what you might call serious stuff, politics, COVID, war. And the second section is lifestyle, the arts, food, music, television, literature, all that sort of stuff. And one of the students said last year, which I wasn't sure about, but she's probably right, she said that typically women are more interested in the sort of stuff in the second section. And I don't know why it might be. I don't know whether there's any overt sexism here, because there are some fantastic female writers in politics and conflict and so on. But it seems to be in the New Statesman, the first section tends to be dominated by men, and the second section, women are much more strongly represented. But excuse me. But the point is, this is something that you can explore, something that you can take further. So, and the key point is that it's something very small. You're just counting male and female in one magazine, and all of a sudden you can get an idea for a perfectly viable and quite substantial piece of research. But it's all about counting. Don't get freaked out by counting. You've been doing it since the age of 3 or 4, folks. I'm not patronising you. I'm trying to be helpful, because so many media students, like I said, they just kind of run away from numbers because they're so complex. But I think that's you're missing out on some great research if you do that. So let's move on to the next example. Oh, actually, before we do that, slide number 30. So the question, methodology, is this approach procedural, repeatable and objective? I'd say it is. It's easy to describe. It's easy to replicate, to do again. Can it be improved? It can be improved by maybe looking at more magazines, by looking at different publications. As I've said underneath, you can compare and contrast the New Statesman over time. That's called a longitudinal study. So you can look at the New Statesman November 2020, November 1990, November 1980. In fact, you can go back 100 years with the New Statesman, and you'll probably find that 100 years ago there was hardly any women writing for it. So progress has been made, you know. You can compare and contrast with other UK political magazines, for example, The Economist, The Spectator. and that will give you a good comparative study. And you can compare and contrast with other countries' political magazines. So a magazine from India, or a magazine from South Africa, or a magazine from Canada, or wherever it might be. And then if you wanted to take it a step further, this would probably be PhD territory, you would explain what you found by interviewing editors and journalists. And I think the editors will be pretty horrified if you mention this to him, and it is a him. He would probably be horrified that there is such an imbalance. But the key point is you need to do not just one magazine, you need to do more to get a fuller picture. Slide 31, this is another example of some research I did with some undergraduates at a previous university. And one of the undergraduates was absolutely obsessed with these chat magazines. You're probably familiar with these, I don't know if you read them. Heat and Closer. So what I did is, it was quite embarrassing, but I went into the local newsagents and I bought copies of Heat and Closer magazine, not my usual sort of magazine. So I bought them, brought them into class, and we sat down and we went through them. And I asked the class, I said, so we had 10 issues of each magazine, quite a big class, 20 students. And I said, which variables can you measure objectively? I'll skip ahead because it's time's running out as always. So what the class came up with, they said the similar sort of thing, the number of people, how many people are featured in the photographs. You can count the people in adverts compared to the people in stories. You can look at male, female. You can look at celebrity, non-celebrity. So you can count all of these things objectively. And all of them, even though it's a bit, chat magazines is not my first choice, but it's viable and it's rigorous, or it can be rigorous form of research. So you can count all of those types of items. The class also said at the Times, one of the students put her hands up and said, oh, we can also look at ethnicity. And I said about that one, and also age, and also physique, and also faith. These are other things that came up. But just be really careful with those 4 things, because there is a degree of subjectivity. You cannot necessarily tell somebody's ethnicity or race by just looking at them, for various reasons. Somebody might identify in a completely different way to the way that you actually see them subjectively. So be careful about that. Looking at ethnicity in photographs is actually quite difficult to do. Likewise, age. Likewise, age. For example, in real life, I look about 32 years old. But on the camera, I look all of my 50 whatever years. So it's difficult to guess people's age by looking at them, particularly if they've had, how can I put it, procedures, like so many celebrities do these days. You'll find out that somebody's 70 years old and they look 26. Maybe not, but you know what I mean. Physique. This is a big subject with undergrad students. Female body image is probably one of the most popular topics I've seen in the past over the past 20 years. But again, it's fraught with problems. And how do you describe it? I mean, it's a subjective assessment whether somebody's slender or well built or full figured or whatever you want to call a particular body type. It's subjective. So you might think somebody is slender and I might think that they are something else, And also faith. This is something else my students brought up. Faith. Can you tell somebody's faith by looking at them? I don't think so at all. I mean, you can maybe get a few clues, because there are certain things like people wearing a cross, a crucifix, probably, maybe, is Roman Catholic, but not necessarily. Likewise, a woman wearing a scarf might be Muslim, but again, not necessarily. So you have to be very, very careful with quantitative content analysis. It needs to be something that is unequivocally one way or the other, like male and female names. Even then, actually, male and female names are not 100% cast iron identifiable at times. So that was the chat magazines a couple of years ago. So some other things that you can do. Slide number 34. How many pages do UK newspapers give to advertising, photographs and written journalism? That's a very easy one to do. You basically get newspapers and you go through them page by page and you estimate how much of each page is advert, how much of it is photographs and how much of it is written journalism. It's very revealing. We'll come on to that in a moment. Second one, how much coverage do newspapers give to a variety of topics, including political, TV, entertainment, celebrity and sport? Again, go through a newspaper and every story you say that one's about politics, that one's about business, that one's about travel, that one's about sport. That one's about entertainment, celebrity stuff, and you can make a note of it, and you can actually count how much of or measure how much of a newspaper or a website is devoted to different topics. Number three, how much exposure do UK newspapers give to a number of sources? For example, you can count how many politicians are mentioned, how many business people are mentioned, how many celebrities, sports people, academics, and so on. And one which one of my students did a couple of years ago, an MA journalism students, I think I mentioned this before, she was Norwegian, and she wanted to see how British newspapers reported her country. So she did a really simple search, Norway and Norwegian, and she looked at all the articles and analysed them in detail to find out how they reported her country and her nationality. And again, that was quite revealing. I think I mentioned it before. The Sun newspaper, virtually every mention of Norwegian was a footballer. So Sun readers, that's all they know about Norway, basically, is it produces footballers. So quite powerful what you can do with quantitative analysis. Let's go back to that first question in slide 34, using a percentage scale across the page space, assess the page space devoted to adverts, photographs and journalistic words. We actually did this in class a few years ago. Wow, 2013, that was how long ago it was. And I divided the class up. Some did the Mirror, some did the Telegraph, some did the Mail, some did the Guardian, and they worked out what percentage of the page was words, what percentage was images, what percentage was adverts. And what they came up with, slide number 36. And what struck me here, well, you tell me what strikes you here, folks. I'll throw it back to you. There's the numbers. What strikes you? This is newspapers, the percentage devoted to different types of content. Does it surprise anybody? Well, it surprised me. It surprised me that we spend, yes, thank you, Cider, adverts. How much of a newspaper is adverts? A third of a newspaper is adverts. Now, I don't know about you folks, but if I'm going to spend money for something, I don't want to be buying adverts. You know, on TV, you get your adverts for free, don't you? That's kind of like the payment. You have to endure, you have to put up with the adverts. It's even worse on YouTube, isn't it? It's really getting interesting, and all of a sudden there's an advert. So adverts are a pain in the proverbial, for me. But a third of the newspaper, 1 in 3 pages essentially, is adverts. And the other thing to notice as well is that the Mirror, which is a tabloid newspaper, and its reading target audience is actually lower than the Telegraph or the Guardian. The Mirror's got more images. That's what you'd expect with something basically for people with a lower reading age. It's like kids' books have loads of pictures in, right? So typically the more popular the newspaper, the more images, photographs you're going to have, and the fewer words. Yeah, exactly, Taylor. It is. Well, yeah, they've got to get the money somewhere. Taylor has just said this is odd considering online news makes you pay to remove the adverts. Yeah, and it's the same with the BBC. You pay a licence fee so you don't have to put up with the adverts. So it's kind of a deal, isn't it? But this is what gets me about newspapers. Seriously, folks, if you like Cosmopolitan or Vogue or any of those women's magazines, you have a look how many adverts in there. I think it's around about 60–70%. But again, it might be a good idea for a research mission. So that's question 1. Commonly used variables. I won't spend too long on this, but just be aware that if you want to do quantitative analysis, there's loads of things. It's not just how much of a newspaper is adverts. It's not just, you know, male or female journalist. You can look at the date. I mean, this is a really obvious one, but you could actually look at how many times a certain subject is mentioned per day, and that will show you a chart like that will show you, like, if there's an earthquake, all of a sudden the earthquake, you know, top of the news all of a sudden, and then the next day when things quieten down, it's half as many, and then half as many again, half as many again. Brexit as an issue has gone like that over time, hasn't it? So, but just drawing a chart like this and analysing that can actually be very enlightening. The prominence of the search terms, sometimes called salience. When you say, if you do a search on Jeremy Corbyn, you can look at how many articles have his name in the title or in the first paragraph, because if it's in the title or first paragraph, that means that the article is all about Jeremy Corbyn. Alternatively, his name might be towards the bottom. It might just be a casual mention. The location of the article, the page number, all the important stuff in the newspaper comes at the front. So if it's on page 28, that's not really that interesting. Article type, article length, topic and sources, etc, etc, etc. So just be aware that if you do quantitative analysis, you've got an enormous choice. But it all depends what your topic is, and it all depends on what you want to discover. Going back to the questions I just had a few minutes ago, question 3, how much exposure do UK newspapers give to a variety of sources? So I've done this already in some of the examples I've shown you with the globalisation protest, for example, and also last 2 weeks ago with the private finance in public services. We looked at sources. The private finance one, the main sources, if you remember, were politicians and trade union leaders. And a lot of people like academics hardly got a mention. But so this is absolutely, source analysis is incredibly enlightening. And it's used very, very frequently, particularly in political journalism. So here's an example, slide number 39. So this is an article from about, quite some time ago, I think. I think this is from my PhD, actually. So the headline, in the BBC, major UK companies such as BT, Tesco and BA are to meet to collaborate on tackling climate change. And what I've done is highlighted the sources in this article in red. So there are 3 sources. First source, BBC business editor Robert Peston, as he was at the time. So he's quoted as saying something. A bit further down the article, second source, shows how long ago it was, Prime Minister David Cameron. Third source, CBI. The CBI is the Confederation of British Industry, which is essentially an industry body, so it represents the interests of British business. CBI President Martin Broughton said. Now, folks, I'm going to throw it back to you. What do you make of that article? Look at what is the topic of the article, and comment on the people that are speaking in it. Just say what you see.
No one from climate change people.
Cider, you're on such good form today. Thank you. Thank you. Right, Cider has hit the nail on the head. So climate change, environmental issue, right? Massive issue. There's nobody from Greenpeace, which is a major NGO. There's nobody from Friends of the Earth. There's nobody from Extinction Rebellion or scientists or people who've studied the climate their whole working lives. The first person to speak is a journalist. So Robert Peston is essentially setting the parameters of the debate, not a scientist. So by looking at articles in this way, it becomes incredibly revealing, and it makes you wonder who makes the decisions. Who decides that Robert Peston goes first? Maybe it's Robert Peston, you know? And the 2 other sources are a politician and a business person. So have a guess what they're going to say. You know, business people don't like environmental restrictions, really, because it stops them making enormous sums of money. Pollution, you know, they're quite happy to pollute so long as they earn plenty of cash out of it, you know. So looking at sources can be extremely revealing, really, really revealing. More examples, slide 40. You can read those at your leisure. There's one at the top there about asylum seekers in South Wales. And there's one underneath about the reporting of, do you remember weapons of mass destruction, as didn't exist in 2003? So it can get extremely illuminating. And slide 41. Slide 41. Okay, let me just tell you what this is. I'm going to throw it back to you as well, but have a look at the numbers very carefully. So this is an article, a journal article about the reporting of Jeremy Corbyn. And what the researchers have done is they've looked at articles from The Guardian, The Mirror, Independent, etc. and they've assessed whether the article is positive about Jeremy Corbyn, neutral about Jeremy Corbyn, critical of Jeremy Corbyn, or antagonistic. Antagonistic meaning really critical. So look at the numbers. What do you make of those numbers? And incidentally, where it says Guardian N equals 145, that means that's how many articles they analysed. So they analysed 145 articles from The Guardian. So anybody, tell me, just choose a number and say how you interpret it.
Well, the most antagonistic was Daily Mail, or no, Daily Express.
Yeah, Daily Express. So Cider, yeah, you're absolutely right. 67%. So that's 2/3 of the articles in the Daily Express were antagonistic.
No, 83%.
83? Oh, I see. Oh, they've divided it, news articles at the top and opinion at the bottom. You're right. You're looking at opinion, Cider. Yeah, yeah. So a news article is a simple report. You know, yesterday Jeremy Corbyn did this. An opinion piece is as the name suggests, it's a different sort of article. Somebody else tell me, look at the totals. So the total at the top, N equals 532. 40% of those articles were neutral, but add 35 and 19 together, 54% of the articles were critical or antagonistic of Jeremy Corbyn. So more than half. And there was only 6% that were positive. So what this says to me, this idea that the UK media is left-wing is absolute nonsense, because they heavily criticised a left-wing politician consistently. And there's hardly any positive coverage at all, just amongst the traditional left-wing newspapers, Guardian, but even then it's only 29%, it's not even 50%. So this can be a very revealing way of doing research, particularly using quantitative analysis. So just in summary, slide 42, it's incredibly useful, quantitative analysis. If you can get your head around it, I keep coming back to this, but please don't be freaked out by numbers, folks. And I suspect you are, because not many people joined in the discussions here. But surely, folks, you've all got GCSE maths, right? And if you've got GCSE maths, you can do quantitative analysis. It's simple aggregates and averages. And if you can do that, it opens up so many exciting doors on fascinating, really fascinating, enlightening research that you can do. So I recommend that you do it. Okay, as always, I've droned on too long. Let's have a break. And then we'll come back and we'll have a look at another example in detail.